so far that has struck me is that even though Moses says to God, he is slow to anger, it just seems that God gets angry very easily. But in the
Hmm.
New Testament, we keep on hearing about, God and Jesus. It's God of love, and this is where I'm having a big disconnect.
Sure. So you're seeing the wrath of God on one side and the all-encompassing love of God on the other side, and there seems to be a disconnect.
And
Um,
I think part of the disconnect also is it's just from my experience, because my two sisters, the church or the Bible study groups that they go to, they emphasize a lot about God's wrath and God's punishment. Um,
mhm,
and it's the same way when my daughter was in college and she joined the Christian group, and they talked a lot about, if you don't do this, you will go to hell. If you this, God will
mhm,
be upset. And to me, that's not, at least not in the Anglican or the Episcopal Church, what we emphasize. And this
mhm,
is where my big disconnect is. And
mhm.
so how do we, if somebody says that to me, you know, what's how do I approach it?
Mhm. So what's the does God have feelings? This is the
He
question
must.
I had. In classical Christian theology, does God have feelings?
Gets angry. He must.
Yes. I wouldn't think so.
Hold on a second. Wait. If God has feelings, wouldn't he be human?
Hmm.
Is God human?
God,
Well,
yeah.
Jesus was
So
human.
And God?
yeah, so this is one of the classic questions of Christian theology. One of the natures of God, according to classical Christian theology, is that God is impassible, which means he does not change. An emotion, aka feelings, is a result of change, of reacting to change and change itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so God, as such, does not have feelings like we do because God is beyond it. So how do you square this notion of wrath and love and all of that? Because um, we believe that God is love. God is the source of love. But there's also this notion of wrath. Um, and so the church fathers, especially Origen and Gregory of Nyssa, talked about the wrath of God and the love of God being the same thing, but it's the human perception of that force of God. So the wrath of God is love bearing on disobedience, if that makes any sense. That the punishment is not really God's, but it's our own punishment in response to the presence of God. So, the wrath of God in this situation is humankind's disobedience coming up against the all encompassing love of God. The change is in us, not in God. The human being, right, perceives that wrath. Is there wrath of God in the New Testament? Where is the wrath of God in the New Testament? Is there any?
Yeah.
Name.
I'm trying to think now. Because it was the Old Testament with the ark.
Yeah.
That's a whole.
But I thought of God, I think of God as like a father, our
Mm-hmm.
father. And you love your child,
Mm-hmm.
but in order to teach them, sometimes you have to be angry with what they
Mhm.
do. Doesn't mean I don't love you, but I'm angry. And he says that that he forgives them, but because of it, you're not getting the promise.
Mhm.
And so he loved them all the way through, carried them all the way through to the promised land, let them see it. But
Mhm.
your punishment was, and I'm going to hold that punishment.
Mhm.
And I think about he's angry with the people,
Mhm.
and he has that reason.
He has
to be
destroyed
angry.
a lot of
He
them
is-
along the way,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, he killed a lot
Promise.
of people along the way, and this is where I'm having problems with understanding.
Because they didn't do what they were supposed to do.
Yeah, there's a lot of bloodshed
Yeah,
in this cycle of scripture, right? I was talking to Lauren about it. I don't know what the head count is here. In one instance, it's 24,000. There's hyperbole, of course, in this, but the message I think is clear that the holiness of God is absolute, and we're meant to emulate that holiness. Could you open up your Bibles and go to the New Testament, to Romans chapter 1, verse 18.
The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godliness and wickedness of men which suppress the truth by their wickedness.
And then it continues, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but because became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changing the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. And so you have this idea of the wrath of God in the New Testament. And the wrath of God it's a difficult concept. But you see the wrath of God first and foremost on the cross. The wrath of God towards humanity, right, is on the cross, right? And you have this notion in Christianity that Christ for us bears the wrath of God, because we could not stand in that place and not be destroyed. This is the message of the Old Testament here, right? In human disobedience, we cannot stand before God and not be destroyed by it. So Christ takes that place, right? That idea of atonement takes that place of us, right? And you see that you see this notion, that same notion also in chapter 21, the copper serpent. Does anyone remember the copper serpent in chapter 21 of Numbers?
The bronze snake.
To
Yeah, the bronze snake.
Right.
weren't there snakes biting the Israelites? That's why
Yeah.
with the snake up there,
Yeah. So God, right? What are they doing? They're doing the normal thing. They're complaining about food and water, right? And they begin to lose heart. They lose faith, right? And they grumble. And God sends serpents in their midst to kill them. And then God also provides God also provides the remedy. And what's the remedy? He tells them to make a staff with a bronze serpent on it, and anyone who looks upon the serpent and not the snakes that are below, who trusts in the power in that, will be healed of it.
Yeah.
Right. So the antidote is provided alongside with the plague. And so that there's that same mystery of redemption right there. That's sort of and St. Paul says it too, right? In Romans, that for all the days of Adam were lived 930 years and he died. Death also came to the world through him. And so you have this notion of the serpent being the plague and the antidote at the same time. Wrath of God, love of God. It's a very difficult all of this to grapple with. It's not Sunday school religion. So, but it is difficult to square the nature of God in the Old Testament and the nature of God in the New Testament. But at the same time, we believe that it's the same God. And so what can it tell us about not only God, but us? So I hope that wasn't a politician answer. But no, this plagues theologians completely, right? Because the idea of the wrath of God is in Scripture, right? Right. And it's a powerful idea, this wrath of God. We'll see it over and over again, right? The wrath of God against the enemies of Israel. And in our popular national imagination, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is stamping out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. Yeah, that's right. And Martin Luther King quotes that at the end of his sermon. Here.
Well, in Romans 13, we have authorities, and if they've been given the ruling, and they give the wrath upon us if we don't abide by the rules. And God is the same way. He gave them the rules to follow. They don't follow them. So you have to do something. You punish them.
But at the same time, God doesn't kill all of them. I know. There's always a remnant. There's always a remnant of Israel that goes on.
Because they
But
have to.
isn't there
in
a
order
remnant that always is
fulfill.
abiding by what he said?
Always. There always is a faithful remnant. This is a notion that you'll see over and over again. But
that's in order to do the covenant that he made with them. If he killed them all, then he.
Again and again, it's the faithfulness of God and the faithfulness or lack thereof of humankind. And here especially in the readings we got, is the lack of faith and the consequences of that lack of faith, because it is only through that faith that people can persevere. Otherwise, they fall. Right?
Well,
so
a slight deviation. He killed Aaron for disobeying him, and Aaron didn't have the staff. Aaron didn't hit the rock. Moses did, but he didn't kill Moses. He just let him wander he couldn't go into the promised land.
So you're reading this whole ritual where they bring Aaron up to the Mount Hor and take off his clothes and let him die.
Right.
You're taking it as he was left out to die on the top of the mountain. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I don't think it says they killed him. Essentially,
No.
he
No,
was
it just
brought up
says he
there to
He
died.
die.
died.
He
But
died.
that happened with
died.
Moses too, though.
Yeah, it's
That
this
happened. He had
notion of
Moses go up and gather the people and be gathered unto his people, and he died up on the mountain too, because he didn't obey. He told Moses he will not be able to step foot in the promised land because he disobeyed.
and there's the look.
And
You
his
also have,
successor and he had him appoint Joshua as his successor.
and who's the successor of Aaron? Eleazar, the priest.
The
So he
priest.
was his son.
His son.
So
Continues.
so you have these sort of mountaintop tableaus, right? For Aaron and Moses, right? Priest, Aaron, prophet, Moses. And so you have these scenes where there's that transfer of authority, right? Joshua succeeds Moses as the leader of Israel. Eleazar succeeds Aaron as the priestly office, or the priestly office. And so this is you're coming to the end of the story of Exodus, where the generation is passed and the new generation is taking up the mantle, which is another biblical reference later on. But there is a transfer, and this is what happens in every situation. It has to happen in every church, doesn't it? There has to be a transfer from generation to generation, otherwise it dies out. And so that's sort of what this is about. This is a preparation for that next chapter, right? And then there's something powerful about multi-generational struggles and efforts, right? Someone who leads a struggle, like Martin Luther King in this particular this sermon, he references this notion very well. The people who initiate a struggle or a movement don't necessarily get to see its fruits, its culmination, and that's the case with Moses and Aaron, right? They do not get to see the full fruits of their efforts, but they are both given a sense of what it's going to be. So I think in a way this is really talking about a very universal human experience of passing on to the next generation. And the Bible is very much concerned about that. You hear the line over and over again, tell your sons about this. Remember that such and such happened here on this day. There's a huge concern about passing the covenant on to the next generation, and you have it right here. So
the other thing that struck me is actually so early on, God has established that if somebody doesn't have any sons, that the inheritance can go to the daughters. That was very interesting and to me, and it struck me.
Yeah, there's some very practical sort of things in here, isn't it? And Judaism in particular is a matrilineal situation. One belongs to the house of Israel through the mother.
Right.
So you do have a very interesting thing. It's not all patriarchal in that sense. Anything else that jumped out for anyone?
And Numbers
or Deuteronomy?
Yeah. Actually, I haven't finished reading Deuteronomy for the assignment, but from what I have read, I actually preferred the narrative in Deuteronomy. To me, it was or maybe this is the second time it's a retelling that made me understand things more, but I actually enjoyed the narrative of Deuteronomy better than it was in Numbers.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about Deuteronomy is that it's probably the product of a single pen. It's the Deuteronomist is the person that wrote it, and so it reads better because it's not a collated text of of things that disagree with and sometimes disagree with each other. It's a single text really, and it's supposed to be the last will and testament of Moses. Essentially, these are the words Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the desert. So these are basically his last will and testament. So the text sets out to say that it's a recapping of everything. So that's absolutely right. And it ends in a beautiful poem, right? But one of the things that interests me in this one is in Deuteronomy 4:41, these cities of refuge. It's very merciful. Then Moses set apart 3 cities beyond the Jordan. This is planning. He's never been there, but toward the rising of the sun. So the manslayer who kills his neighbor without foreknowledge, without hating previously, might flee into one of these cities and live there. So this is provided for accidental death. This notion of someone who has killed someone and is probably hated in the community for this accident has a place to seek refuge. And you can imagine that accidental deaths happen quite a bit in the ancient world. And so this is actually extremely merciful. So
my other question, the other thing that really struck me is how do they know the geography so well in places that they may never have seen or know?
Well, the geography we're talking about right now is not very big. So we're talking about, let's say, the Nile River Delta, okay? That's as far west as we're talking about, to southern Turkey, and as far east as Iran. That's the whole area that is pretty much discussed in the Old Testament. Occasionally you'll mention some place further off, but that's pretty much the world that existed for them. So it's a place that in ancient times was walkable. It would take a while, but you can walk, let's say, from Egypt to Turkey in a month, maybe. Maybe. Depends on how fast you walk. But no, seriously, you probably could. They were much more accustomed to walking.
They were wandering for 40 years, but does that mean like really
no, but even
they were going?
But okay, let's talk about the area that we're specifically talking about in Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers. We're talking about about the Sinai Peninsula, all the way to the River Jordan. That's only about 200 miles. So from here to Rhode Island is what we're talking about at the most. Okay? So people run marathons today. What is that? 24 miles and 26 miles. 26 point.
26 plus. Yeah.
Yeah, they do that in a day, right? They're athletes, of course. Yeah.
Hours.
So that's only 10 times, less than 10 times that. So we're talking about a pretty small amount of area we're talking about in a 40-year period, and most of it centered in a couple of locations. So the geography was known. What's interesting in the ancient world is that they had fairly accurate maps. So we're talking about this book was probably written right 8th century BC or something like that, and it's pretty much analogous with the Homeric epics, and that's talking about a much larger area in the Mediterranean. So it astounds. I think it's astounding for modern people to understand how well geography was known. There were astrologers and such at the time that could calculate the appearance of stars, during the year. They knew when that was going to happen. They may not have understood the science behind some of this, but they understood more about the world than we would probably give them credit for.
I have a map I can hold up to my camera. An inch is 100 miles. Now, it's a small picture, but oops, I moved the light.
Yeah.
And
it's not a very big.
Yeah. There's my finger, so you can see how small this is. And it says about an inch is 100 miles.
Yeah. So that whole area, which is much more than we're talking about right now.
Right.
Yeah. So we're talking about the middle of the Sinai Peninsula, right? I've got a similar map, I guess. Yeah, we're talking about.
This is showing the route of the Exodus.
Yeah.
And where the 12 tribes settled. That's what this map is showing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now they weren't constantly moving because the Lord had told them, he would tell them when they were moved.
Yeah.
So they'd stay in the spot for a period of time.
This has the probable route in which little dots.
Yeah.
It sits down here, probable route, and it shows the whole way down.
Yeah.
God bless you. Oh, I thought you sneezed. No.
Yeah.
What also fascinated me is the ability of their senses, how they're able to take census. I mean, it's not an insignificant number of people for each of the tribes.
No.
It's still a lot. I was just absolutely in awe that they're able to establish all that genealogy and do all the census so accurately.
Yeah.
Well, we think it was accurate.
The Old Testament does talk in hyperbole sometimes. So we don't. I'm not going to say that the hundreds of thousands of people that they're talking about at times is necessary. It may not actually. Okay, I am going to pause here for a second and explain something about the narrative of Exodus. Okay. Modern biblical scholars, secular biblical scholars, not necessarily religious, but modern historians and scholars of the texts, okay, are not certain, okay, that any of this happened from a non. No, this is. So we're talking about a story of faith in some ways, because there's not there's not really any historical evidence of an exodus, other than the scripture. Okay. There's nothing outside. There's hardly anything outside of it. There's no archaeological relics out anywhere that would, if you had a movement of that kind of people, you might expect
garbage.
Yeah, you might expect
They didn't have
something.
anything to eat. They didn't
So,
make any garbage.
But there will be carcasses.
Well, that's true.
So,
People died.
Yeah, how many thousands were killed
Yeah.
in the one?
Well, they became dust.
yeah. So when we look,
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking
Go ahead, Bob.
about all these thousands and thousands of people. I had a conversation with the Methodist pastor that I worked for, and we were talking about the killing of the innocents. And they always make it seem like it's hundreds, if not thousands, of babies that were killed. And he said it's actually probably only maybe 4 or 5 because the town was small.
Right.
And, they don't all constantly go around having children all the time. So he said, so there's a number that's gotten blown up. So it's the same idea as killing 24,000 people. They want to make a point, I think.
Absolutely. You want to find out what the population of the entire Earth was? Let's say 1000 BC. There were 50 million people on the entire planet.
Wow.
At that time.
Wow.
The entire planet. We're talking about all the continents.
Right.
Okay. So let's think about
How do they know that?
that can be demonstrated archaeologically and
Tax collector.
That's probably easier to prove
The
than
tax collector.
let's say the population of Palestine in the time of Christ. Okay. So there were approximately 500,000 people living in the entire region of the Holy Land and at the time of Christ. Okay. So
How
roughly
many-
the size
how many can you repeat that?
500,000.
Okay.
500,000. So approximately the population of Cleveland, Ohio. So not a in the entire Levant. So we're talking about very small communities, right? There, when it says 22,000 people were killed, logically you sort of have to take that with a grain of salt, because that's a huge number, right?
Of the total population.
Of the total population. That's so when we read these, especially these earlier texts in the Old Testament, right, the emphasis is on its theological intent, what it's telling us about the nature of God and the nature of human beings. You know what I'm saying? Because the earlier you go back in the Old Testament, the more, there's not a good word for it, the less historical it is. And we're talking about stories that have a theological point more than stories that necessarily represent something that actually happened in the exact way that it said it happened. Now, I believe that there probably was a Moses and there was an Exodus, but the numbers, the people of Israel it was a very small community at that time. So I hope that isn't a downer.
No.
It's the truth.
Um, so, and my view on it is a moderate view. You know, it's not a particularly conservative point of view on it, but it's not a liberal view, right? So, anything else stand out?
I'm interested in hearing from you, Father David, as to what you think are the key take-home points from this week's readings.
The key take-home points, okay? The key take-home point is the story of redemption, the story of God's relationship with humankind is a back and forth. You have God's promise on one hand, and you have humankind's response to that promise, right? God's promise remains steadfast, but humankind's response varies at time in its faithfulness. So you have, you know, last week we ended with the discussion about the golden calf and all that stuff. That sort of thing keeps happening over again. That lack of faith and trust in the promise, right? God promises the people of Israel that he will bring them to the promised land and provide for them en route. They continue to lack that trust that's going to happen. They demand the water, they demand the food. They're constantly longing for, Egypt. And that points out a key theological point that as Christians, right, we trust that we have been saved, that we're free from sin and death and everything like that. And we trust in the promise that's been given to us, right? But sometimes we long for Egypt. We long for Egypt. You know, we long for. That's right. And so that's a point. That's one of the points for us that we like, in a way, being captive. We don't necessarily want to be set free from the things that have held us back, right? Those habits and all those things that have harm us, right? We sometimes like those things. That's one of the take-home points. Another take-home point is this continued issue of idolatry. Okay, and you'll see it over and over again. And what is idolatry? It's setting up something to worship other than God.
We have it today.
We have it today.
That's my big time.
We have it in the form of money. We have it in the church. And what form of idolatry do we have in the church? And I think
Statues.
What?
Statues. We have
Say-
statues. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Statues.
Oh, that's, well, you know, the early Protestant reformers would exactly agree with you, Jerry. But we're not going to go into a conversation about that necessarily. We'll talk about that a little bit if you want. But an issue in the church, I think, is an idolatry of the past. Okay. As time goes by, we set up an image of a glorified past that may never have been.
Right.
And it gets better and better as the years go by, right? Right. And
The numbers grow.
and we just want to go back there, right? We just want to go back to the way things were. And sometimes I think as a church, we worship that image of what church used to be, even though that church never existed except in our minds. But we set up that instead of God, right? We say, oh, if only we get a few more butts in the pews, right? Something like that. The object isn't to get people into the pews. The object is relationships and opening up folks to the knowledge and love of God, right? But so that's one thing. But so we have this problem of idolatry, right? That continues. And then another issue that one of the main takeaways, I think, is this passing of the mantle, right, from one generation to the next, right? the situation in Egypt is necessarily different than the situation in the wilderness. And then the situation in the promised land is going to be different than it was in the wilderness. And new leaders are needed for each of those stages. And so, so that the question of passing on leadership. And then it mentioned a couple of times that God tells Moses to delegate things, right? And so the community of God is not a personality cult around Moses, right?
Right.
Moses was doing it all, and then God said, have set up the 70 elders, set up this whole system in place. So that's a good lesson for us in the church, that we can't all do everything all the time. We need to delegate, bring new people in, and trust that they will do a good job, so to speak. That's a practical takeaway. And then the another one final takeaway is that this story of Exodus and promised land is a motif that we hear over and over again. And those who read that Martin Luther King speech or listened to the brief clip of the tail end of it online, see that what he was talking about is that this whole civil rights movement, he knows that he is not going to see the end of it, but he is satisfied knowing what it will be, that it's coming, and that he's been to the mountaintop. And that's like Moses. Moses goes to the Mount Nebo, and he has seen, and from Mount Nebo you can see from the river of Jordan all the way to the Mediterranean. You can see, within that horizon, you can see the whole of the promised land. And that's true today. You can go up on Mount Nebo, which is in Jordan, just over the line, go up there, look across, and you see the whole of Palestine, Israel, all of it, in one breathtaking view, all there. And that's where Moses dies. And so that notion of not seeing the fruits of your labors, but trusting that the work you've done in your life will come to fruition in the next generation. So that's my takeaway for the reading. And then there's laws and all that too, but those are the main points. And then it ends in that lovely Song of Moses in chapter 32. And I suggest that if you haven't finished reading, just skip ahead to that and read it. It's gorgeous. It's a beautiful work of poetry.
It is beautiful. It's very beautiful.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts before we end for the evening?
Just that we still don't get it.
Well, that's okay. That the point is not to get it all, but that we've opened ourselves up to grappling with these texts. And very seldom do you pick up the book and say, I'm going to read Numbers and Deuteronomy today. It's not something that comes up often.
That just like those in the desert where we kept not having faith and trusting God, we still fall away from.
We sure do.
And I look at what's happening in the Middle East, and I keep thinking, it's what is going on was going on back then.
Yeah.
It's just on a massive level now. Now we're talking, when we say thousands, we mean thousands being killed.
Yeah. And there is a religious element to it.
Oh yeah.
And because there is a radical element within Israel. Not everyone, not necessarily your average person that lives there, but there is a radical element that has a lot of influence with Netanyahu's government that says, this is the promised land. This is the promised land, and God has said that this is ours. And that's actually a very dangerous idea in many ways. So, but you can see where in scripture folks would turn to be bolstered in that view.
But it's such a small sliver of land.
It's a very small sliver of land,
And
and
there's nothing there. It's terrible. It's non-areable. You can't grow much.
that's not true. Actually,
No,
you would be-
Israel
you would
is
be-
really good about it.
you should Israel is an astounding landscape. So in Israel, okay, in the north of Israel, you have alpine climate with mountains and snow on the top and everything. On the coast, you have a Mediterranean climate where you can grow grapes and everything, very lush and green. And in the south, you have almost a tropical sort of situation. When I was in Israel, I swear to you, I saw bananas grown and pineapples.
Wow.
You can grow that in Israel, and you do have desert, for such a small area, it's actually an astoundingly diverse landscape. And in the time of Jesus, in the time of the Old Testament, okay, when you hear the Old Testament talking about lions and jackals and crocodiles and things like that, they were there at that time. I mean, the River Jordan today is a little stream, but back then it was a rushing river with there were hippopotamuses in it, these animals we associate with Africa. There were elephants in the southern part of Israel. I mean, it's wild, and there's historical evidence for that. It was a different world than it is today, but it's still a very diverse environment. Now, Gaza, you heard Gaza mentioned actually in your readings. Yeah. Should be, by all intents and purposes, a resort community.
Should be
A resort community. It's so beautiful. Where Gaza is, it's like coastal Italy or something. Seriously, it's right on the coast. It was the beaches there. It still is. Still is the coast.
Yeah, it's still a coast, but it's been bombed a lot.
Yeah, it's probably.
Oh yeah, it should be beautiful. It should be beautiful, but what they've done there is it's basically cordoned off, and but the Egyptians and everyone else is involved in doing that too. So
we just need to send in some developers, in other
It's
words.
like Lebanon, years
Hotel developers.
a beautiful.
the Paris of the
Beautiful.
Middle East, they say Beirut
Yeah.
was. Yeah.
It was gorgeous.
Did you go there before?
No,
Oh.
but I saw a picture, and I remember Thomas, Danny Thomas. He was from there.
He was from there.
Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was a beautiful resort area.
Oh yeah. Yeah. At the turn of the 19th century, right? In terms of not 19th, 20, in terms of the 20th century, into the that area of the world was the safest place on earth. The Middle East. You could take a train. You could take a train from Cairo to what was Constantinople, and you'd never have to have your passport looked at. So I mean, and just a very different world. That this isn't Bible study talk, but it was really the powers after the First World War that carved up that really started the problems we have now.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
It's a reject.
Yeah.
Got one at home. I know.
Yeah, the story of Lawrence of Arabia really glorifies something that probably wasn't all that good. So, any further thoughts? I've rambled a bit here, so.
Actually, I really enjoyed this format.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe we'll be definitely using that as because some of the stuff we're reading becomes less and less narrative and more thematic, because there'll be some poetry and things of that sort definitely we'll continue with this. But sometimes we'll just go through it line by line, what happened, but with this, we repeated the same stories a couple of times in some instances. So, yeah. Well, we'll see you on Sunday. Some of you I'll see you on Thursday. So, all right.
Oh, yeah.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Night.
Yeah, thank